Welcome to Chapter 15, Section 1. In this, we're on page 414 in your textbook. In this chapter, we're going to look at ways in which the government can try to help stabilize the economy when we're facing a recession or very high unemployment or when we have very high inflation. What can the government do to try to solve these economic issues? But before we get into that, it's important that we understand the concept of macroeconomic equilibrium. That's what Section 1 is about. And as you remember back from way earlier in the semester when we talked about equilibrium price, it's where the supply and demand curves come together. That's where the market is balanced, when the quantity supplied is equal to the quantity demanded. Okay? Well, we're going to do that on a grander or much larger scale. We're going to look at macroeconomic equilibrium. In order to look at equilibrium, we need to look at supply and, over here hidden, demand. Okay? But instead of looking at the supply and demand for one product at a time, like we did back in Chapter 4, 5, and 6, we looked at the supply and demand for candy bars, or for your labor, or for an automobile. Now we want to look at the supply and demand for all goods and services that are produced in the United States. Okay? We use the term aggregate supply and aggregate demand. Okay? When we use the word aggregate, that means total. Okay? Well, what is the total amount of all goods and services that are produced in the United States in a year? Well, that's real GDP. Normally on a supply and demand curve, we put quantity down here on the horizontal axis. But the quantity of all goods and services, not just cars and not just hamburgers or haircuts, but of all goods and services that are produced in the United States in a year, that's real GDP. So we're looking at the supply not just of one item, but of all the items that are made in the United States. Normally, over here goes price. Okay? But if we just use the word price, that would be the price of one item at a time. The price of a car, though, is way different than the price for a candy bar. Okay? So in order to graph aggregate supply, okay, we use the term price level and real GDP. Price level goes on the vertical or y-axis, and real GDP down here on the horizontal or x-axis. Just like we would normally put price and quantity on a individual supply curve. Okay? And as you remember, supply curves slope up and to the right. Okay? At these prices, whatever those prices are, whatever the prices currently are in the United States, okay? If we look at price level, okay, our economy would supply this many. This is how many goods and services we would produce at these prices. Okay? But what if people were willing to pay a higher price? At higher prices, well, then the suppliers would supply more. Just like the regular law of supply, at higher prices, the quantity supplied would go up, and at lower prices, the quantity supplied would go down. Okay? That's why supply curves, individual supply curves, or in this case, aggregate supply curves, slope up and to the right. Because at higher prices, the quantity supplied would be more. The quantity supplied for all things, whether we're talking about hamburgers or cars or candy bars or haircuts, the supply would be greater at higher prices. But what if the suppliers were willing to supply more at the same prices? We would show that by the curve shifting to the right, just like before. If the curve is shifting to the right, that means the suppliers are now supplying more at the same prices. And we'll talk about what will cause that in just a minute. Okay? But if the suppliers said, even at the same prices, whether the prices are here or here or here, if the suppliers are now supplying more, that's called an increase in aggregate supply. If the suppliers are supplying less, if the curve shifts to the left, that shows that suppliers are now supplying less at the same price. And what would convince all suppliers, not just the suppliers of cars or hamburgers or haircuts or candy bars or car washes, but what would convince the suppliers of all goods and services to want to supply more or less, even at the same prices? Well, like the supply of an individual product, it's often tied to the cost of production. That was a term we learned way back in chapter 5. The cost of production means what does it cost to make the item? Okay. If minimum wage were to go up, President-elect, I should say, Biden, is talking about raising the minimum wage. If minimum wage goes up, will the cost of production go up? Yes, because now we'll have to pay the workers, many workers, more money. And when the cost of production goes up, when it costs more to make something, the cost of production makes the curve shift to the left, because suppliers won't want to supply as many at those same prices. As you remember, that would mean prices would end up going up eventually. Okay, but at those same prices, if the cost of production goes up, that means the supply is going to go down because it's more expensive. Some of the things that will cause a change in the cost of production for all goods and services would be like oil prices. Oil prices are very important in our economy because they affect transportation costs and the price of gasoline. Okay? But you might not know this. Oil is also used to make plastic. Okay? So if the cost of oil goes up, the cost of anything that's made with plastic is also going to go up. And how many things in the United States are made from plastic or shipped in plastic? So if the cost of oil goes up, the cost of production is going to go up and the supply curve is going to shift to the left. If labor costs go up because of a raise in minimum wage or because a union contract gets union workers more money, these are causing the cost of production to go up. The supply curve would shift to the left. What would cause the supply curve to shift to the right is if it becomes cheaper to make things. If new technology is developed that makes things being able to be made faster and more efficiently, new technology would shift the supply curve to the right. And there's some other things that we're going to talk about in section 2 that will also cause the curve to shift to the right. But aggregate supply is just like a regular supply curve. It slopes up and to the right, and it can shift to the right or to the left if there's a change in aggregate supply caused by a change in the cost of production. Okay? Cost of production will be affected by oil prices, labor prices, productivity, technology, and so forth. All of those can cause a change in the aggregate supply. Okay? But in order to come to macroeconomic equilibrium, we need not only aggregate supply, but we also need aggregate demand. I didn't want you to get distracted. Okay? Aggregate demand, like all demand curves, aggregate demand slopes down and to the right. Okay? Again, we're talking about the demand not just for one item, but the demand for all items in the United States. If we could somehow look at the demand for all the cars and all the hamburgers and all the haircuts and all the car washes and all the candy bars and all the houses and all the everything that is made in the United States, we'd be talking about real GDP. That is the quantity, remember quantity normally goes down here, the quantity of all goods and services that are demanded in the United States. And not just at one price, but at all the prices. At today's prices, this is how many goods and services are being demanded in the United States. At these prices, This is how many is demanded. Well, what do you think would happen if prices went up? If price levels went up, if the price of all goods and services, cars and hamburgers and houses and haircuts, if the prices went up, people would demand less. And if prices were to go down, people would demand more. That's why aggregate demand, like all demand curves, slopes down and to the right. Aggregate demand, like all demand curves, slopes down and to the right because at lower prices, people will demand more of everything, and at higher prices, people would demand less of everything. Well, just like a regular demand curve, okay, aggregate demand, the demand for all goods and services, can shift to the right. That wasn't very good. At this same price, people are now demanding more goods and services. Or if it shifts to the left, a decrease in aggregate demand. That means consumers are demanding less of everything that's made in the United States, even though the prices are the same. And you think, well, what would cause people to demand more or to demand less, even though the price has stayed the same? There are three things that will cause a change in aggregate demand. Only really one thing will cause a change in aggregate supply. But a change in aggregate demand can be caused by taxes. If the economy is in bad shape and the government lowers our taxes, how will people respond to lower taxes? Well, they're now going to have more money in their pocket, so they'll demand more. They'll demand more even though the prices stayed the same. So the price of all goods and services stays the same, but because the taxes went down, people have more money. So they're going to buy more goods and services. Obviously, the opposite would be true. If taxes go up, people now have less money, and so they'll buy less goods and services, even though the price of those goods and services is still the same. So the first thing that will cause a change in aggregate demand is taxes. Second one is a change in the amount people save. And we talked a little bit about the importance of saving when we talked about your budgeting. We're going to talk about it again in the next chapter as well. And savings are good for you, but not always good for the economy. Because if people are saving more money, that means they're spending less. So if people save more, which way does the aggregate demand curve shift? If they're saving more, they're spending less. And so they'll buy fewer goods and services. They'll buy fewer goods and services, even though the price stays the same. When the pandemic hit, okay, some people were worried about losing their jobs, and so they began to save money. Well, that's not so good for the economy, because if people are saving, they're not spending. And of course, if people save less, that means they're spending more. They're spending more. The last one is transfer payments. And we talked about transfer payments back in chapter 10. Transfer payments are when the government gives money to someone and gets nothing in return. Things like Social Security, unemployment benefits, welfare benefits, the stimulus check that the government gave out because of the pandemic to help a lot of people that had lost their jobs. Okay? These are all transfer payments. If the government increases transfer payments, like giving money out for unemployment because a lot of people lost their jobs, or they increase it because of the stimulus checks, those $1,200 payments that many adults got. Okay? What will happen if transfer payments go up? How will people respond with that extra money? Well, they'll demand more goods and services. And as we're going to learn in the next section, that's exactly why the government did give out that money, that $1,200 for most American adults. They got $1,200 so that they would continue to demand goods and services with that extra money. So if transfer payments go up, aggregate demand shifts to the right. One of the things that we learned is that Social Security and Medicare are causing a great deal of problems in our economy. Okay, the amount of money that's being spent on them is causing the deficit to grow every year. If the government chooses to spend less on Social Security, giving old people less money, that will cause aggregate demand to shift to the left. All right. So what happens when we put aggregate supply and aggregate demand together? When we put aggregate supply and aggregate demand together on the same graph, we get to the point we call macroeconomic equilibrium. And that's a mouthful. Macroeconomic equilibrium is the point where the aggregate supply and aggregate demand curves intersect. Just like all equilibrium points, it's the point where the aggregate supply and the aggregate demand curves intersect. This is where our economy is at today. This is where our economy is at today. We're paying these prices, and our economy is producing this many goods and services. Our economy is at macroeconomic equilibrium today. Our economy is producing this many goods and services, and we're paying these prices. Macroeconomic equilibrium is the point where the aggregate supply and aggregate demand curves come together. But what if we don't like macroeconomic equilibrium? What if we don't like this point? What if we don't like the point where our economy is at today? Well, what if the government decides to help the economy get better by giving out those stimulus checks, giving out $1,200, increasing unemployment benefits? Okay? You might not be aware, we're going to talk more about unemployment in the next section, but the government gave an extra $600 a week in unemployment benefits. What did all that extra money do? Well, as the government increased those payments, that causes the aggregate demand curve to shift to the right. And that will move the macroeconomic equilibrium, causing the economy to grow. So when the economy was going into a recession because of the pandemic, the government started pushing more money into they did push more money, not the government, the Fed did. But the government began to pay the workers, the unemployed workers, more money. They gave out $1,200. That was all designed to shift the aggregate demand curve so that the economy would continue to grow. But what do you notice is the downside to this? It does put pressure on prices to go up. And on page 417 in your textbook, it talks about the dilemma facing the government and the Fed for that matter. Okay? The dilemma that the federal government faces is, how do they get the economy to grow without causing prices to go up? The government is trying to help the economy grow by these stimulus payments, by increasing unemployment benefits. And that's a good thing. They are trying to help the economy get better, but they also know that that could cause prices to go up. And therein lies that dilemma. Okay? That's going to be on the test. Okay? The dilemma that the government faces and all policymakers face is how do we make the economy grow without putting pressure on prices? All right. Macroeconomic equilibrium is where the aggregate supply and aggregate demand curves come together.